Chapter 3. Text for video. Super God via vacuum theory, otherwise known as the quest to discover more to a relationship with nothingness. If you've already come across this, I apologise, but I'm trying to I copy and paste some of my work sometimes, and this is copy and paste. I don't want to bore anybody, but this may take a while. Okay, so it's grand. When it is considered through frequent experiments that particles can sometimes be created and destroyed within a vacuum, or rather these particles can sometimes live and then die in an area where there is nothing to be found through the absence of matter, whether these particles are considered as quark particles or even pre-quark particles, we begin to realise through a near empty physicality of a vacuum, all life is considered possible, even when there is no matter present. For the most part, it is not so clear the extent to which emptiness can be observed, which is one statement I would like to consider in this work, and which is a subject which has been touched upon through the ages. In order to understand more, if we can ever consider the nature of a perfect vacuum, in this case describing a perfect vacuum as nothingness, whereby life can be identified without matter and indeed without particles. When we get to such a result, we then reach the exact point of being capable of observing nothingness, and we may look upon nothingness as being as much part and partial of life as any other form of energy. We may even say this to the point of describing an absence of matter as a form of energy. In other words, if quark particles or even pre-quark particles are observed in a vacuum, to what point can we truly consider the idea that a vacuum is exactly perceived as an area of life without matter or without particles? One of the main points of this paper is based on the idea of how an absence of matter may in actual fact be a fullness of life. It will also be asked how one may apply the idea of consciousness to an absence of matter, if the absence of matter is actually the fullness of life. The result of such a concept coincides with the result being nothingness, may be described as consciousness on its own terms. This suggestion can be proposed another way by identifying consciousness as the energy of thought, or to bring such a hypothesis a step further by stating nothingness may be combined with the energy of thought, which can also be, in this particular case, described as the most basic form of energy. We could even say with the most basic unity of energy present, there may be an attempt to produce the second stage of an energy of thought. This energy of thought may well be the first birth concept of a thought within a vacuum. As such, while we are observing a vacuum, and when we come across a quark, we may in actual fact be observing the physicality of a thought process taking shape, thus suggesting the energy of thought has been brought forward to create a thought within nothingness, or with another way of putting it, by observing consciousness creating consciousness. With such proposals put forward, we can then say if nothingness with consciousness is energy at its most simple form, otherwise identified as life without particles or even life without matter, though being still present with energy, no matter how basic such an energy is, then the presence of a vacuum can then be observed through the idea the energy of nothingness or the consciousness of nothingness is self-creative. The idea the vacuum creates its own self, as well as everything else through energy which is present, can be identified as a consciousness act of being a vacuum. That is to say, the consciousness act of being nothing therefore suggests nothingness exists as the fullness of nothingness within pre-thought energy, and therefore before any unit form of energy. The question which is then posed regarding what nothingness is can be identified over a period of time before it releases itself as pre-thought or pre-quark or even pre-energy. This idea of nothingness and time suggests the whole idea of nothingness consciousness would require a style of building block in order for nothingness to bring about any concept of its own self. In another argument, what kind of world or universe would we have if we take both consciousness and the most basic unit of energy away from nothingness? We propose the question once there is an observation all matter and all pressure is completely absent, and ask ourselves what a vacuum is without quarks or pre-quarks constantly evolving. One would suggest in this case we are still observing nothingness, but done so over a period of time when there is no energy and there are no quarks or even particles before quarks. If this is the case, and the vacuum that has been observed is absent of everything from energy and matter to particles and subparticles, we can firmly state how nothingness therefore has a time span and therefore has a lifespan. In this case, if there was a lifespan to nothing, which can be considered to be a plausible idea with all things being equal, we may venture into old niche territory with the idea God is dead. Such a philosophy would be coupled with the idea of Christian teaching death can be described as eternal sleep in one reading of an afterlife, along with the other idea of paradise. In such a way, this suggests in a dreamy sense of all known concepts how nothingness may actually have a subconsciousness attributed to it, which suggests nothingness may well have been dreaming about consciousness through the idea of eternal sleep, suggesting therefore God is dreaming if the idea of God can be identified as the full shape of the universe. As a way of explaining the idea of the way in which consciousness can be linked into nothingness may also be related to the Fermi paradox and other ideas expressed in philosophy. One such example can be identified with Berkeley and Locke, with the idea, quote, if a tree falls down in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Joining up this philosophical idea as a full extension to the Fermi paradox and the idea that although there are billions of galaxies, billions of stars, and therefore trillions, if not zillions of beings in the universe, it could be suggested the universe we perceive as Earthlings is perceived as a different universe and all the other planets through everything known as life. By following such an idea right down to its very core, the entirety of life that concerns Earth may simply concern Earth, and this may be argued further by the fact all that concerns the most recently discovered exoplanets simply concerns those same exoplanets and those same exoplanets alone. To simplify such a debate, each planet in the universe may well perceive different realities, with the idea there are planet realities for different planet realities, with different universes than ours, all understood on all the other planets. From this same suggestion, we can say that there are indeed possibilities for many multi-universes, with the idea there is a separate universe for Earth to explore, just as there is a separate universe for beings and planets and galaxies such as Andromeda and Sagittarius. Therefore, the suggestion is, if we understood each reality on each planet in the universe, we would understand the fullness of life, which may in actual fact be the ultimate purpose to all of life since the very first beginning of time. Perhaps for this reason, we are nonetheless continuing to try to communicate with other intelligent species within our universe in our own particular ways, especially through the whole process of all our sciences and all our arts, as well as all our other subjects, which is one of the main reasons why the idea of nothingness in astrophysics is an intriguing subject. A question that will be repeatedly asked is this: who put nothingness there? With such a question posed, we will then delve deep even further into astrophysics philosophy and ask the question how we can, as individuals, and even as a collective body of individuals, physically relate to nothingness. This is expressed with the whole idea when we look into a microscope in a laboratory and identify germs on a plate. We communicate with germs through our laboratorial instruments. Since we do this, if we consider all living creatures having a consciousness, including germs, it is possible to communicate with the consciousness of nothingness, which we know as absence of matter. As a follow-up question, we can then ask, is it possible to communicate with nothingness even if we discover it does not have a consciousness, since it does not have any matter? What should the language be used in that case? Do we even use language? Is it a case that our observations are enough, given the fact we use Berkeley and Locke again and ask the question, is nothingness even there when we look away from our observations? Dare I suggest in this paper, there may come a time when we identify our own ideas of what consciousness is in relation to nothingness. Certainly when we consider consciousness in relation to our own selves, noting how we have shared similarities as individuals in relation to one common threaded idea that this is life. For the majority, the idea this is life may be understood by us, but we may also understand there may be people living in life who may have consciousnesses but may not be capable of producing one thought. We could also suggest there may also be others on this planet who are not from this world, and may have joined up with the rest of us to compare and contrast our world from their world, and may not understand our idea of consciousness, but may fully understand superconsciousness. Indeed, there may even be others who are present with us who may not even be from this dimension, and may never communicate such a reality to us. Though we may live an entire life, we may never comprehend how they even existed in this dimension, which would baffle us completely if we were in their shoes, never being capable of understanding the substance of their being. With regard to nothingness, we perhaps need to know more about what an absence of matter is in terms of science. According to Niels Marquardt from the University of Dresden, who specializes in this area, he states that there is no ideal vacuum, quote, which he is quoted as saying in a chapter titled Introduction to the Principles of Vacuum Physics. For those of you who may wonder about such a specialized topic, Marquardt goes on to explain what a vacuum is by stating a vacuum is only a partially empty space where some of the air and other gases have been removed from a gas-containing volume. For this same reason, he makes the point there is no ideal vacuum, which suggests that in this area of physics, the ideal factor for studying such a complicated subject on the working of what nothing is in terms of nothingness being a complete empty space, which would essentially mean it was in actual fact fully empty from all air and all gas in order to fully explore the idea of nothingness. It is only fair to suggest in this case the findings of an empty space before the Big Bang is still very much within the infancy stages of thorough study in terms of scientific capability. In the early stages of the 21st century, where the humans have proven themselves to be quite ignorant in terms of their study, and whether we can fully accept we are actually fooling ourselves when the New York Times quotes how one of Nick Bostrom's beliefs is how life is made up of a word conspiracy. We have to ask ourselves, what is wrong with all of us? I say this due to the idea the Greeks discussed atoms in astrophysics over 2,500 years ago, around the same time Buddha began a lesson for his followers on the idea of what was meant by emptiness. We can also see how one of the earliest teachings in Jain philosophy goes by the belief the universe has been repeated numerous times over. Later, we can also identify a fullness of life 2000 years ago through the belief of the Holy Trinity, which may be perceived through the poetics of God as a vacuum, Christ as a particle, and the Holy Spirit as gas or air. Similarly, in both Hinduism and Judaism, we see how the idea of the unknown, through the teachings of Tao, is shared with these religions. Expressed in Hinduism as Brahman, and may be contrasted as a study in Judeo-Christian terms as the Word. With this example, in relation to the unknown, Brahman, and the Word, it could be suggested these same scholars may well have been setting an example to others in the future to follow them down the path of a scholarly life, emphasizing to those who would come after them in the future the idea certain ideas which trickled down to them from the future were too difficult to teach to others as a result of the difficulty of translating fully the concepts and substance of words such as quarks. The theory may well have been known to them in ways we cannot understand, the instruments for such learning not being made available to them and wouldn't be made available to anyone for many hundreds of years later. In a similar way, when we pay attention to the design of the Qibla at Mecca, we must take into consideration how its design can only be marvelled at as a construction for Muslims as well as for others to marvel at. In many ways, the Qibla was identified as a form of a future world for people to pay close attention to, with the idea concepts such as space explorations and the way in which astrophysics would play a most gigantic role in space exploration would become commonplace in a far distant future, such as this future, for example. When all these factors of organised religion are taken into account, we can only look at ourselves and pose the question how we are living in the 21st century, and discover how remarkable and quite idiotic it is that outer space wasn't physically reached by any man, woman or child until Yuri Gagarin. A few years later, we paid close attention to Armstrong's walk on the moon as the first step of humankind on the moon. Certainly, I am of the full belief we can consider ourselves a sad civilization when we take into account in terms of Boston's belief of there being a world conspiracy when one would be inclined in stating there must be a book somewhere on a dusty shelf with a complete know everything from the years 8 billion BC to 9 billion AD and counting. By the end of life, we would probably have evolved as an intelligent gas species or otherwise. As such, we can hardly fathom the question of emptiness, which seems to be about the reality of nothingness. But if we were to measure nothingness to its fullest degree, or indeed to its shallowness, we would quickly realize how life would necessarily be fully possible, since there is no ideal vacuum. As Marquardt expresses, when such studies are brought forward and are expressed closer to home, we learn how, quote, the interstellar particle in the Milky Way, for instance, consists of gas, plasma and dust. When those particular materials and substances are taken into account, the point being made, the Milky Way has to be studied fully as a result, therefore effectively proving how there is no such concept readily available to humankind for absolute nothingness in terms of how one would possibly consider through the absence of matter that either gas, plasma or dust may well have been present before the Big Bang. If this was to be the case, the whole wonderment would be about the size of nothingness, which would essentially be zero to all levels. To complicate matters, we then question zero and the size of zero, which brings us all the way back to a concept of how there would ever be a notion of how we state to one another. And I thought about taking in the factor of nothingness in no time at all. Accordingly, we evaluate a layman's philosophical display of questioning timelessness, or even how the speed of time is considered wholly about the idea time is effectively man-made, and the fact that it is therefore It therefore encourages us to look back to an event or a series of events leading up to the Big Bang. Questions will be posed and would correlate with the whole idea about the telescopes that are used to identify the birth of the universe, and how there will be so many questions to ask in relation to the birth of the universe. One such question would be about the position of the Big Bang in the universe in relation to the positioning of our villages, our towns, our cities, our Earth, our solar system, and even our universe. Such a question would then be posed about the size of the universe 13 billion years later, after the Big Bang, in relation to the size of the universe a million years after such an event. It would then be questioned if our telescopes were capable of focusing on every single past event relating to the whole history of the universe. More questions would be asked on the whole subject of other forms of galactic phenomena that possibly occurred at the very beginning of the birth of the universe, which may not have been identified by Earth's telescopes or were incapable of being identified by Earth telescopes in relation to all we know about our place on the planet, moving through another space we've all come to partly know in the 21st century. As a point of making it very clear as to the original concept of what the nature of nothingness is in relation to the whole idea, if it has a consciousness to speak of, when in a personal context I have immediately believed the first ever thought I had in life was, love, I am born. To this end, and using the same personal thought as a catalyst for posing questions of the language of the universe itself, noting its silent nature as we move through life, all the while wondering as the universe continues to move and grow north, south, east and west, stretching all galaxies away from one another, and the way we are all observing the universe moving us all through life, from my own personal perspective, at the way it moves at its own speed, I tend to wonder exactly what speed it actually moves, particularly when the nature of time fluctuates on planet Earth, and when light may not always be fully identified on planet Earth as the light from the sun, but may in actual fact be light from another star millions of light years away from our solar system. In that regard, ideas can be posed as to the theoretical hypothesis of the consciousness factor of nothingness being void-like or empty in the beginning, of how nothingness is theoretically conscious. This void-like consciousness gives the impression the darkness of nothingness, just like the darkness induced by patients under medical anesthetics, can evaluate how the consciousness of nothingness as a void-like reality considers the whole idea of introducing light. It does so over the course of the lifespan of nothingness, with the idea nothingness says to itself in a language it has come to be imaginatively known as light becomes me. Of course, when we identify for the first time in our lives the enormity of life on Earth spinning through the Milky Way, then ponder the whole concept of infinity and eternity for the first time in our first ever looks at the sun, the moon, the stars, the sky, perhaps with regards to how simplified we tend to use our language in relation to our translation of the birth life as a whole. Maybe we're being too basic in the sense we need to know the language and measurement of astrological readings, but that it is done so in conjunction with complex astral mathematics, astrophysics equations, and perhaps quantum computer languages, linked up to the most up-to-date telescope focusing on everything that operates beyond us in what has sometimes been described as the heavens. It is then when we return to logical statements regarding the idea nothing has to be made out of something, with the notion of humankind there has to be something there before nothing. Nothing cannot exist on its own accord. Certainly this would be the case if we were to follow a logical trajectory of most organized religions, taking into account the supreme God existed before nothing. With such a theory brought forward in the 21st century, noting how God has not introduced its beings to us in any human-like shape since the Gospels were written in the life of Jesus Christ. through this very same lesson of Jesus Christ identified as the only Son of God. It is only when we consider the idea, the reason we have not been capable of discovering the perfect vacuum as a way of examining nothingness more closely is due to the whole fact in human terminology and human logistics. We see a mirror of life whereby God is the vacuum of life. As a result of this theory, when God thinks, therefore in terms of the human way God thinks, and in the human way we may consider God to be either fully alive, snoozing, within a deep sleep, may well be meditating, or indeed may well be dead according to Nietzsche, which may in fact be possible to say as a result of the notion that God is dead, which may therefore be considered a suggestion God is going through a process of reincarnation. We can also suggest God may well be going through a death tunnel, which God experienced from the very first moment of the birth of the universe, suggesting therefore God is very much alive, but is going along the way to paradise once God's journey through the death tunnel comes to an end, thus marking the end of the universe, which may bring about the idea the entire universe manages to experience heaven once God reaches a state of nirvana laid out for God. With such human theories in mind, it should therefore be said, in the very least, as expressed through a human way of thinking, and since I have stated such a case already in this paper, the energy of thought, or a particular quark, or a particular pre-quark, or a particular atom, may be experienced by God through God's example of his own self as the vacuum, all of which is introduced to us through whatever human processes we can identify how God could be living. In this way it may then be expressed how we bring all the mirroring images of God's energy of thought into our realms of understanding this energy as a form of elementary particles, and we can therefore note how impossible it is for us as humans to fully comprehend the idea of nothingness, particularly when it is pointed out to us through all studies there are physical substances in outer space. In this way, as humans, and through our life as students of life, when we realize the presence of space dust in the Milky Way, we can only begin to ask if space dust has a form of intelligence, and then proceed to ask further if this space dust is in any way related to any human understanding of God beyond science. If we were to therefore suggest the idea God may be identified as a vacuum and is thought every now and again, and produces particles as forms of these thoughts, or even expressed through the energy of thought, we may then ask how an absence of matter may in actual fact be considered a fullness of life, particularly so if we go along the route of Marquardt's suggestion there is no perfect vacuum, which may mean we are going into a territory which goes beyond human capability, suggesting an illogical idea nothing is capable of producing nothing. If that was the case, if we were to make an illogical concept of nothingness being capable of producing nothingness, we are entering into forms of Hare Krishna territory, in the sense that although there has not fully been a visitation from God through physical truth histories, there is still a whole belief in God, since it is true we cannot fathom God's thinking 13 billion years after the birth of the universe. With a viewpoint, God may not even have one thought, or even thought energy, and communicates with us in a way we may never learn to understand. This theory may be expressed through a particular reflection of life, which takes us all on a journey through which we can go by certain doctrines within Hare Krishna beliefs, a super God created the God we have all come to know as omnipresent and all-powerful. It is then, when we have come to an understanding of this concept, we look at the idea of heaven, followed by super heavens. Certainly, when we apply Christ's teaching to the prayer, Our Father, when Christ states, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, we identify how Christ is actually stating there may well be different levels of heavens. We can say Christ is proposing the idea we also die in heaven if it is God's will for us to die in heaven. To descend in terms of science, we can look at this suggestion and we ask, therefore, how an absence of matter may in actual fact be a fullness of life. Since there is no possible way as of yet to create nothing, especially when scientists such as Marquardt state there is no ideal vacuum, it is thus making it very difficult for scientists to fully study nothing. In this paper, I went by the logic of what I describe as Hare Krishna formats of astrophysics, which suggests if God has a super God looking over him, and we are stating that God was created by a super God in a similar way in astrophysics, nothingness could be produced in order to produce nothingness. The question seems to be the case: why would this be done? Another way of putting this question goes a long way of asking, why is nothingness so important to study? The answer would essentially be the case of how the absence of matter may be all about the fullness of life. In other words, if we wish to understand the fullness of life, we would therefore have to understand what lies beyond space within the realms of superspace. To make this clear in terms of science, since God did not appear to all of us physically within truth history, it is up to us then, in terms of science, to look at the whole idea of nothingness when we study beyond the borders of the universe. By studying everything there is to know about life, we therefore go beyond matter, which is equal to going beyond the vacuum. And it is at that juncture when we enter into the realms of grounding ourselves and thinking about listening to a Soundgarden album such as Super Unknown. In basic human terms and in basic human communication, we look to all this life without fully listening to Mozart's Twinkle Twinkle Little Star composition that goes along with all the signposts for us to read what the stars and the planets may well be communicating with one another. Within this same human terminology, in order to give life to God, it could be said God is undergoing a medical examination on God's brain, making the point the Earth and the Sun and all the other planets and stars in the universe are in actual fact the brain cells of God. It may then be pointed out superspace, or what lies beyond all our comprehensions of the universe, or rather what lies beyond the borders of space, may well be described as the mind of God, and we can then proceed forward through a further study of all that God is. As a concept, to consider God in such a way is a beautiful thought, just as the compilation album Mothership by Led Zeppelin is a beautiful thought in terms of a title for an album. Yet, as I have pointed out, these concepts are art-life ideas and do not take into account the language of God between other gods. Neither do such ideas take into account what other species and other planets have to say regarding these same proposals. In this way, we have to use our imagination to try to understand what other species on other planets have to say in relation to the way in which we may in actual fact be overriding a basic tenet of science fiction. This can be seen in the whole sense through some proposals. The Prime Directive, introduced to us in Star Trek, is in effect compromised. In other words, as humans, we are going against the Prime Directive by effectively challenging beings from other planets, while we are also challenging our idea of God. To this end, we ask ourselves, is it also up to us to become omnipotent and omnipresent as forms of God, just like our human understanding of God? Or is it a case we simply wait and see where life takes us, continuing along the path of life as humans, but many of us hardly thinking about the idea of all that a total absence of matter is possible when we take into account the full study of life. Therefore, being capable of knowing everything from 13 billion years ago as far as into the future to 10 billion years from now, when it is calculated in a casual manner, the sun dies out. It is for this same reason I am suggesting the absence of matter brings us all to the fullness of life if we were to design ourselves as God. Another way of putting such an idea into reality can be seen through the way transhumanism has taken us along on such huge levels of life and full living, therefore suggesting we can actually create our own beings eventually as God, which would be for our own benefit, all of which would be based on the human concepts of what we consider God to be in terms of understanding God as an all-loving, omnipotent, omnipresent, and everything else we consider God to be, including the fact God is absolute power. Such ideas may well be introduced to the future of humankind as forms of self-programming quantum megacomputers. These same megacomputers may then produce invisible quantum nanochips or even invisible quantum quark chips. But when such a result leads self-programming to the idea of intention, it is at the point of intention which may also be identified as self-intention. We therefore ask about nothingness again. At this point, it will be stated once and again, when we attempt to study nothingness through a vacuum, and when we realize there is no perfect vacuum in human terms or through human logic, we learn there is no perfect vacuum simply because we went against the basic tenets of the Prime Directive as written about in Star Trek. This way, when we look 5 to 7 billion years from now, when we become God is identified through the prism of stars, planets, black holes, dark energy, quarks, and even atoms, as well as everything else relating to life, including godlike thought energy, we go against the grain, in this case against Nietzsche, and bring God back to life through our own idea and understanding God wishes to know God, and therefore did not die, but was resurrected from the dead. In other words, if we considered God as everything contained within the universe, we can safely assume God did not allow the universe to die. After all, Christ promised everlasting life. End of chapter 3 of Quark Living Through Superspace. End of video 3. I hope you're enjoying it so far. It might be a bit boring, but boring maybe the future. Possibly. At least it's interesting. At least I enjoyed writing